Hello and welcome to episode 31 of the Wilder podcast. In this episode, we journey across Europe with James Shooter, host of the Rewild podcast. We cover some of the inspirational rewilding projects he visited. We reflect on the trials and tribulations of road tripping with a young family. And finally, we explore the remarkable power of storytelling. Chloe, good morning. Chloe, good evening.
Good evening, Tom.
It's not the morning, it's the evening.
No,
it's very late.
Thematic of fact, we're recording at 9 o'clock again.
Oh my goodness.
We made a new rule though, no more evening recordings, so we're going to stick to it.
Yeah, we will, probably. Well, welcome everybody. But specifically, if you are new and haven't been to this podcast before, very quick overview. We are Chloe and Tom, husband and wife. About a year and a half ago, we decided to sell up everything, move out to Monmouthshire and start a rewilding project. Despite having diddly squat experience in nature recovery, rewilding, ecology, or basically anything useful.
Some other skills, just no skills in rewilding.
In the thing we're going to go and do. Mm-hmm. So we thought, well, if we're going to do this, and hopefully it'll be successful, let's document it and speak to some great, interesting, inspirational and knowledgeable, most importantly, people. Share that with everybody so that if two enthusiastic amateurs can do it, then you can too. Even if it's just your garden, your window ledge, or wherever you are in the world.
And as well as the education elements, what I love about this podcast journey is the opportunity to hear some really powerful stories and emotional stories at times that have been both an inspiration, a motivation.
And humour as well. And this one is definitely going to be one of them. James brilliant, and he brings a wealth of experience with him. And of course, being an experienced podcaster, he communicates it wonderfully. As is tradition with the podcast, we often give an update on the Grange project, just a short one before we go into the interview. And this one's going to be super short, actually. We just got one update and then we'll go into the chat. And it's all about money.
This is an unusual start for a rewilding podcast. Tell more, Tom.
Well, we are at the stage of the project where we've put a lot in and nature is starting to thrive. There is something special now about going for a walk around the land, where before it would have been like a pea green desert the year before. We go there and it's the standing hay everywhere and the pigs have rootled and there's so many mini flocks of birds flying up from the ground.
I love this time of year. The autumn colours are just stunning. Even this afternoon, I've been sat at my desk all day doing various bits and pieces, and it got to like 4:45 and I knew the children were going to be home at 4 and I thought, I've got 10 minutes. I'm just going to go out for 10 minutes and just stand and appreciate what I can hear, what I can see, what I can feel around me. And it absolutely rejuvenated me for the rest of the day.
How have we gone back into nature and this is going to be about money?
Because nature is so much more fun.
Yeah, but it all has to work and all has to pay because we've got big aspirations. So we are at this point now where we've got to work out where we're going to start generating some revenue from. We've done a lot of work on the website. If you haven't been there for a while or indeed never, I wouldn't blame you, but have a look in the show notes. There's a link to the Grange Project website. There's an amazing video that shows the before and after, in terms of after the interventions and after nature's had a chance to recover on the project, done by an amazing 3D artist, Karen. Again, link to her website will be in the show notes. Worth looking at that. And one of the primary ways in which we want to generate revenue is through corporate sponsorships. And now we've got a corporate brochure, a very pretty brochure that's set up. So we are hoping that the listeners may know someone or indeed have their own business they may want to come and support the project on. So in the show notes, again, there will be a corporate partnership brochure. And that sounds very corporate-y. I get that, I understand that. However, it's actually really exciting. It's an opportunity for businesses to come and get involved in the project at its earliest stage. The revenue generated will allow us to focus on not just the nature restoration, but a lot of our outreach. We want to support local schools and inner city schools to get out to wilder nature, for us to be able to chat to them about what wilder nature really is, the importance of it, and why we should protect it and let it thrive. But not only do the corporate partners get that warm, fuzzy feeling that they're supporting that, but we've got the Wilder Lodge that's being built right now, which is a great place to come and bring a team to. We have our own psychologist on site in Chloe, where they can help teams think about some of the systemic challenges they're facing. We've had a company reach out and ask if we can run a day to help their sales team improve their resilience when things aren't quite going their way. We've had another company ask whether or not we can provide a day for their team to come out and just explore how better to communicate as a team in wilder nature.
And I think the amazing opportunity of here is not only do we have the fantastic Wilder Lodge, which is going to be newly converted and full of glass and fantastic news across the project, but we have the resource of nature itself and what that provides in terms of opportunities for team connection, experiencing the benefits of being out in nature and how that informs creativity and problem solving and improves your attention. But we also have the opportunity for team building exercises, whether that's building a brush pile or helping us to plant some trees. It's a real day where you're going to come across with a real tangible sense of difference and impact.
So if you really do want to support the project, please feel free to forward on that brochure to anyone that you think may find it interesting. And the final point to say on that is that we are a community interest company, which essentially means we're not for profit. So anything we generate will be spent on the main effort, which is nature recovery and outreach to schools. Right, done. Are we ready for the chat?
I think so.
So without further ado, allow us to introduce you to James Shooter, science communicator and the host of the Rewild podcast. Welcome, James, to the Wilder podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
I think you are the first fellow podcaster that we have had on, someone who has created a podcast from scratch in this sector and kind of know the challenges associated with it. How do you feel being on the other side of the microphone?
It's weird. Uneasy is is the best way to describe it. I like being in control of my side of things, and it's now taken completely out of my hands. So you're putting me outside of my comfort zone.
Yeah, so I'll be kind in the editing, I promise.
That's good.
So for anyone that hasn't come across yourself or the podcast you're associated with, would you mind giving us a bit of a background about yourself? And then if it could kind of meander its way into Rewild podcast, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I'm primarily a photographer and filmmaker. I guess you could sum it up as a kind of science communicator.
It's posh.
Yeah, it is posh, yeah. Science communicator with a camera. Yeah, I've always had a passion in kind of conservation and things like that. I find it fascinating how things work, how systems work. And when this kind of newfangled kind of rewilding term came up, I jumped at it because it's, incredibly interesting. And I like the fact that there's not always a clear answer to all these different solutions. So I've been working for a Scottish rewilding charity for, since its inception, the last 5 or so years, and its predecessor, which was called the Wild Media Foundation. That morphed into a charity called Scotland the Big Picture, and I've been working there on the communications team as a photographer and filmmaker up until the end of 2022, when my wife and I decided that we wanted to essentially quite selfishly go traveling around Europe and soak in as much nature as possible. So yeah, we went all in. We sold our house. We quit our jobs. We bought a 20-year-old motorhome, which wasn't the best idea looking back, and packed our 2 kids in and dog and set off. It was meant to be just a jolly, really, initially, just to enjoy nature for a year. But yeah, with such a big lead-in time, I kind of thought, well, you're going to kick yourself at the end of this 12 months if you don't make something out of this incredible journey that we're planning. And yeah, I guess as a photographer and filmmaker, the first thoughts were maybe photo blog, maybe YouTube. But the photographer inside of me would have wanted to be everywhere in spring and autumn to get everything looking visually peachy, which just isn't possible. So that's initially why I started looking down the podcast route. I'd never done podcasts before, but went into that. And my dream partner in that would have been Rewilding Europe. So I made a pilot episode from one of their rewilding landscapes, which is just up the road from me, Afric Highlands. Slapped it on the desk and asked them if they'd be interested in collaborating, and thankfully they were. So that was the start of the Rewild podcast.
Every step of that is, I think, fun and inspiring, and I like the slight kind of outside the box thinking entrepreneurial element to your journey, where it's like most people just think about it, but the fact that you went, oh yeah, how do I get the outcome that I want, which is the podcast? Okay, well, I need to put a bit of time and effort into it, a bit of speculative, and get ready for rejection, because there was no guarantee when you decided to do that podcast about rewilding, your specific site, that they were going to support you. Did you have contacts in with them before, or was this completely out of the blue?
Yeah, loosely. I had met Franz Scheppers, the CEO. Scotland Big Picture hold this conference every other year called the Big Picture Conference, and he came to speak at one of those. So I had met him in the past, and yeah, loosely kind of in the rewilding world, but I didn't know them very well at the time. Well enough to send a speculative email to see if they'd be interested. Yeah.
And a lot of the listeners, I think, will be very much inspired by your decision to get away and really immerse yourself in nature. Just out of vague curiosity, your better half, is she also obviously interested in nature, or is it just purely your passion that we're taking you away?
Yeah, she is. She's always been interested in wildlife and animals. She's kind of got a background in animal behavior. She's done a lot of work with rescue dogs in the past. She's worked as a zookeeper, so she's worked on wolf behavior there, which was really interesting stuff.
Oh, cool.
And she's now got into the communications side of things as well. So she works for a conservation charity up in the Cairngorms called Saving Wildcats. So they're the ones bringing European wildcats back to the Cairngorms. So She's always had a general interest. Yeah, I've kind of made her get even more interested in things like birds and stuff like that. And she's always had a love of Greece. She's always gone to Greece as a teenager and things like that. So I was never kind of a beach holiday kind of person. So the way she hooked me in, maybe tricked me into going to those kind of things, was to try and find some common ground. And she took me to a northern Greece, basically a trip for 2 weeks, which turned out to be a big nature, bird ticking holiday, which we both fell in love with. And that's probably the root of this wider journey, is that we enjoyed that so much just across 2 weeks, seeing as much nature as we could, and thought, well, let's maximize that. Let's times that by a few and let's go for a year. So yeah, it's entirely her fault that we did this thing, but I'm glad we did it in the end.
And thinking from the position of a parent ourselves of 3 children, I'm kind of curious about the practicalities of the 20-year-old motorhome and the ages of your children and how up they were for this experience.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how up they were for it. Maybe they were forced, like without knowledge. We basically wanted to do something like this and talked about something like this a good few years back. And almost as we were starting to plan to do something like this, we found out Jen was pregnant for the first time. So that put the brakes on that idea for a while. We weren't sure that we'd go back to it, but yeah, then we had a second child as well. And once the crazy kind of newborn stage got out of there, these thoughts started to creep back in about, well, we do actually still want to go traveling. And our oldest at the time was 3, so he was getting towards school age. And so we kind of thought, well, why can't we do it with the kids? And if we're going to do that, we need to do it now, because it's either now or retirement. And who knows what will happen between now and then, quite morbidly, you might not even get there. So we basically decided, let's go for it. And, the kids are quite small. They were 3 years and 18 months, so they packed into quite small spaces, which was always handy practically. And yeah, it became the new norm for the kids. We were really terrified of Brody, our oldest, asking to go home for the first time when we set off in the van. That was the moment we both thought we might kind of tear up and think, oh, what have we done? But he never did, not once. He never asked to go home. But when the van broke down, he was straight on asking, where's the van? When are we going to see Vivian, our van, again? So it was quite interesting. It just becomes their new norm, and we were with them 24 hours a day, apart from when I'd go off for a few hours to do these podcasts on the way around. So to them, they had their parents around all the time. The dog loved it as well, because we were around all the time with him. He'd sleep in between the driver's seats. And practically, yeah, it works quite well. We decided to go for a motorhome instead of a cool camper van to, I guess, try and have a bit of comfort along the way. What I really liked doing in a very not cool motorhome was waving at all the cool van drivers that wave to each other and try and get them into my gang instead. And you can see them look a bit embarrassed, like being waved at by a massive white motorhome on the motorway. It's quite funny.
It's absolutely brilliant. And yeah, I don't know how many shivers down my back thinking about if we were going to go do something like that with the kids and the dog and sanity. But I also, with rose-tinted spectacles, can imagine it being also quite freeing and quite liberating. What I'm really keen to get out of this chat with you is to essentially live vicariously through your experiences and really kind of summarize that whole trip. And if nothing else, I want the listeners to be able to be pointed towards a few episodes and go across the Rewild podcast, and also to benefit from all your hard work with that series. So taking a step back, would you mind, for someone that hasn't come across the Rewild podcast, would you mind just giving an overview of what it is, the premise of it, and then maybe we can go into some of your experiences?
The Rewild podcast, as I mentioned earlier, that I hooked up with Rewilding Europe because they were the obvious partners to try and collaborate with something like this. They've got 10 rewilding landscapes across the continent, big areas, sometimes hundreds of thousands of hectares, that they have local teams on the ground working on to restore nature, basically. And they also have a network of kind of third-party collaborators that are doing their own thing but have come together under a network as well. So the Rewild podcast was going to visit all 10 of those big rewilding landscapes. You've got Afric Highlands in Scotland, Iberian Highlands in Spain, the Greater Coa Valley in Portugal, the Velebit Mountains in Croatia, Central Apennines Italy, Southern Carpathians Romania, Danube Delta Ukraine/Romania, Oder Delta Poland and Germany, and the Swedish Lapland, funnily enough, in Sweden. And so we were going to hit all 10 of those. That would form the skeleton of our journey. Then make up the rest. We kind of signed up to do 18 episodes on our journey and make up the rest from kind of interesting third-party projects along the way as well that would maybe add something different to the wider, bigger picture landscapes that we were visiting as well. I wanted the podcast to be quite immersive. I come from a filmmaking background, so I almost wanted it to be documentary style in the way that I did it. And yeah, I wanted to be in the field, talking to the people on the ground, seeing the landscapes we were discussing, trying to join an activity every time, because that always adds a bit of interest. So in the Netherlands, I was kayaking down the river, looking at the river restoration stuff. Went to see a vulture release cage in the Iberian Highlands. So yeah, I wanted to kind of quite selfishly have a great experience for myself, but also bring people along for the ride as well. I met 2 or 3 contributors for each episode and discussed different elements of their project. Sometimes physical restoration stuff, sometimes how the nature work they're doing there is affecting the local community and how the positives that that's bringing in. So yeah, fascinating discussions across the whole shebang, really. It was an amazing experience.
As a listener to the podcast, I think that word you described of immersive is a really accurate one. The feeling you achieved and the fact that you have all those different perspectives that are telling slightly different stories throughout each episode really does create a really holistic picture of the kind of landscape or the project that you are stepping into. So yeah, thank you for doing such a good job of that, because they're really engaging. When you look back over those 18 episodes, is there a particular project or place that stands out for you, and why is that?
There's definitely a few highlights. It's probably mean to pick out just one, but and I feel quite biased here as well, because one of the ones was on home ground still. So I did make 2 episodes before I went from Scotland. One was Afric Highlands and one was sea wilding. I really love sea wilding. It's on the west coast of Scotland. They're involved in creating seagrass meadows and native oyster beds. And the reason why I really love it, A, is something different. A lot of people think of trees and forest or maybe apex predators when you think of rewilding. So these are 2 marine species, keystone marine species, but ones that people don't really think about. The thing I really love about it is that it's a community that came together to make this happen. So instead of waiting for government action, which is slow and fickle and doesn't always happen, they kind of looked out of their local sea loch and wondered, right, well, how do we improve our natural environment surrounding us? And they, instead of waiting for someone else to do it, they decided to do it themselves, which I think is so inspiring. And now it's this incredible project that's inspiring other marine initiatives across the country. And it's really involving of anyone that wants to turn up and do something. There's not very many reintroduction projects where you can stand and just throw your species into the wild and that's job done. I mean, there's lots of paperwork in the background, of course, like all these things. But people turn up and get a handful of baby oysters, essentially, and cast them into the sea from the side, and they all have a barbecue or a beer afterwards. It sounds absolutely incredible. So that was one. And yeah, I don't know, maybe another was the Greater Coa Valley in Portugal. They had some really interesting things with local enterprise, actually. So it was quite fascinating, the deals and collaborations they've set up. One was with a local winemaker. So the kind of valleys around this area are a big wine producing landscape, essentially. And they've set up a deal with Symington Family Estates, I think they're called, wine producers there. And they've made this rewilding wine. And it's got this beautifully illustrated bottle with Iberian links on there and wolf and things like that. And they basically donate part of their sales back into the rewilding projects for the Greater Coa Valley. And it's a win-win because obviously the rewilding team get funds out of that deal, but actually their rewilding wine is one of the most popular in their collection because people think, well, if I'm going to drink a bottle of wine, I can help something along the way. Fantastic. Drink wine for rewilding. Who doesn't love that? And another thing they set up, which was really interesting, was a deal between upland sheep farmers and a sustainable shoe company. So the head of operations, Marta, she was telling me that they basically set up a deal where this shoe company called Wilding Shoes would go out and buy wool from these upland sheep farmers that were willing to farm alongside wolves. So it's turning that negative association into a positive one. And they'd buy that wool at a much higher price and then sell that story to their customers. So in that case, it's kind of a win-win-win because the farmers are getting more money for their product and the wolves are getting left alone a bit more because they're worth something to that landscape. And the shoe company is getting a great story to sell to their customers. So I really love little stories and intuitive collaborations like that. And for me, it goes from just merely looking at coexistence, which is what we talk about a lot in rewilding, how to coexist with wildlife. To me, that always sounds really almost apologetic. Who wants to just merely coexist with something? I like to think that we should be aiming for co-prosperity instead. So where wildlife and people can thrive together. And it's those deals where that allows that relationship to form. So I'd like to see a lot more of those really intriguing propositions being made.
I think those are both really interesting examples, because when you think about large-scale rewilding, you're often thinking about conservation charities or perhaps government role in re-establishing wilder nature. But actually what you're talking about there is the power of community and the power of business, ultimately, in also generating those opportunities. One thing I was thinking about, in the UK, it's sometimes hard for us to consider the scale of rewilding that they have in Europe. We're a very small island, relatively, and we don't really have those spaces of wilder nature that they might have in Romania or Poland. And I suppose I wonder whether you could talk a bit to what that was like to be immersed in some of those massive landscapes where we're really talking about wilderness, as opposed to some of the national parks in the UK, where actually sometimes the nature is more depleted inside them than it is outside of those spaces.
Yeah, I think that in the UK, nature is still something that you go out and visit on a Sunday. It's something nice to do with your family. You know, when it's a nice day, you get out and go and see a bit of nature. In Europe, in a lot of these places, it just feels like you're in nature. That trip to Greece that I did with my wife, we were just in nature for the entire period almost. And we travelled from east to west in northern Greece. And it's just intertwined, you know, it's not dealt with separately. And you look at the UK and even road verges are trimmed to within an inch of their life. And it's like we have to keep every little bit of our landscape neat and tidy. Things are getting better in the UK for sure. Like things are moving in the right direction. That's really, really good. But we do need to move faster, and we do need to move bigger and better. And that's what Europe was for me. Like, yeah, standing on the top of a hill in Slovenia and looking out at forest for as far as the eye could see was incredible. Same in the Carpathian Mountains in Romania. So yeah, we have an issue of scale in the UK, and especially probably England and Wales. Scotland is slightly different. Less people here over a wider landscape, and we're slowly starting to see some large-scale initiatives in the Highlands now. So Cairngorms Connect, for example, is 600 square kilometres, I think. And some of the land there is restoring quite brilliantly. But yeah, in Europe, it's quite eye-opening to see how much nature is left, quite inspiring to see and to want that back home. You know, I think that's really part of the experience for me, was to see these wild places and think, well, why can't we have that back at home? You know, we can have at least a lot more. In Scotland, we have 4% native woodland cover, which is nothing. You know, if I hadn't told you that and I said, well, in Scotland, we really want to have 10% native woodland cover, I'd imagine most people would say, well, you only want 10%. That doesn't sound like much. 10% of the land covered by native woodland. But that's more than double than what we have now. So, you know, we're dealing with really small percentages in the UK for nature that is left. But yeah, things are changing, and that's inspiring to see back home as well.
One of the things you said earlier, I'd like to go back to it, is obviously my kind of background is military. And I've been thinking about the war in Ukraine quite a lot recently in terms of just the carbon impact of all the munitions being used there, and the complete destruction of whole habitats for as far as the eye can see across where the battles are taking place. So your comment about the Delta and it sitting across multiple countries, did the war cross over into the conversations that you were having and the effects that was having on wildlife?
Yeah, definitely. So I went out to the Danube Delta, but stayed on the Romania side. I was banned by my wife from crossing that border. Which did make, I made the mistake of having the conversation on loudspeaker in our van with the team leader of Danube Delta, and he managed to get out before the war fully took grip. So he's based in the Netherlands at the minute. But he was saying that I could go over to Ukraine if I wanted to and meet the team on the ground, and said that you can get a ferry across the Delta essentially and go out and meet the team. They'll meet me on the other side, he said. And the ferry's only been shelled once. And I remember letting out a bit of a nervous laugh at the time, thinking, oh, and then it really hit home how serious that actually was. Like, you know, he was saying that as a positive, that it had only been shelled once. I mean, that is absolutely terrifying. But I found that one of the most inspiring initiatives I went to. I say I didn't cross the border. My phone did latch on to the Ukrainian phone service at one point when we were about, I don't know, a mile away or so from the border. So I interviewed most of the people there remotely. But yeah, there's people still there in the west of the country, still releasing wildlife. Whilst war rages in the east, they're still releasing kulan and hamsters and steppe marmots, and I find that absolutely incredible. What a hopeful thing to do as war rages in part of your country, to still be trying to restore nature in the other side. And I think that's such a motivational thing to do. And it really kind of hit me emotionally that people would still be focused on that. But it shows how much hope that rewilding can bring. And I think, hopefully when this horrible war is over, it's people that are doing that kind of thing that will still bring some inspiration to the people that live there and make them want to stay and bring some hope for the future. And I think that's utterly inspiring.
And for those that aren't sure where the Danube Delta is, if you Google it, I've just done that. It is, I can understand your wife's concerns. It's just off the Black Sea, opposite Crimea, where there's the Black Sea fleet of the Russia was essentially operating in that area. It's down from Odessa, which again, all these names that people will recognize. So I can appreciate that. And I think that just underscores what you just said about how impressive it is that people are still caring about nature during this time, how close to the conflict it actually is.
Yeah, she definitely had a point. I think probably quite secretly I was happy that she said, I'm not crossing that border. I was like, oh no, please, I really want to.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, some of the Rewilding Europe team from the main team are still going out there and visiting the local team on the ground. So the area that they are concentrating on is very rural and hasn't really been kind of affected itself. So there is still a quest for some normality there and some essence of normal life. So it's not all bad news across 100% of the country, of course. But yeah, it's quite an interesting place where they've almost got these two prongs to the restoration there. Obviously, the Danube Delta is primarily wetland restoration, but then they're also doing this stuff on the Trutana steppe, which is completely opposite end of the spectrum, really dry, arid kind of grassland landscape. So yeah, really fascinating.
Yeah, I was wondering where the hamsters were going in with little boats through the water, but yeah, it makes sense. I mean, notwithstanding the challenges of military conflict, what were some of the other unexpected events that occurred during your journey that you had to adapt creatively to?
They were mostly van related, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
It wasn't a good sign of the times when we broke down on the way down from Scotland. So we lost fifth gear on the way down. So Jem, my wife, was like heavily revving on the motorway down, trying to stay at 50 miles an hour. It was still obviously sounding pretty bad. So that was our first fun thing with the van. And then on day 2 in France, we got a flat tire, which again was quite fun to deal with in a new language. So we had to try and tour around 3 or 4 garages to try and get that fixed, which we eventually did. And then we had 3 or 4 months of bliss, and it was amazing. Those first 4 months were incredible. If it was all like that, I'm not entirely sure we would have come back, to be honest. Waking up somewhere new every single day. We set off in mid-February, so we were just starting to get into spring. We headed down to the south of France and then on to Spain and Portugal. So it's a really nice temperature for me, who doesn't really like the hot very much. Just getting into the best time of year. So yeah, we were all really loving it, and the kids were blossoming. Brody, my 3-year-old, would just randomly walk up to people in shops and shout "Bonjour," whether we were in France, Spain, or Portugal, didn't matter where. So they were loving it. And then yeah, it was going from France to Italy, and I think it was my idea, so I hold my hands up here, that I wanted to take the scenic route. So we decided to go through a high mountain pass in the Alps, from France into Italy. So we were going, previously as well, we did push the van a little bit too much probably. In Portugal, you can just drive up to the top of the highest mountain, which is 2,000 meters. And you just drive up and up and up and up, and then it's a big plateau. You kind of go around a big roundabout and go back down. But anyway, this high mountain pass, we were going higher and higher, and Jem started looking at me shiftily as we started passing ski routes and ski lifts. And we were going above that. And she was like, it's time to turn around. This is getting ridiculous. And I was like, no, we're close to the border. Let's just keep going. It'll be fine. And then literally about 5 miles away from the Italian border, like we could have walked there, a live ski route just crossed the road. So it's just like 30 meters of snow, maybe like 2 or 3 meters deep. And we'd gone that far that I really considered just plowing through. And then some snowboarders went off in front of us and decided that probably wasn't the best port of call. And funnily enough, it was a day after that our motorhome well and truly gave up. So just a massive grind and a clunk on a French highway. Thankfully, there was a little lay-by afterwards, so we pulled in there. And someone in a high-vis jacket informed me that it looks like the cam belt has gone, which I am not mechanically minded at all, so I had no idea what that meant. But for those that want to know, it basically means that all the pistons inside the engine keep on running and basically destroy your engine, quite effectively. So we were stuck in the south of France for a month. Crimea River, I hear everyone say, but we were stuck in the best month, kind of May, where, it's best for wildlife spotting and things like that. And then eventually it got dragged back to the UK. The French garage, I think, got annoyed at us for not going through with the fix with them. And they just piled all the tiny little bits of engine loose under the bonnet instead of putting it in a box or something like that. So half of that went missing on the way back to the UK.
Oh.
And the first job for the person that was fixing that was to piece that all together and map out what was missing. So that took 6 months for the van to get rebuilt. And effectively, It was rebuilt the exact time that we were due to finish our year-long adventure. So we got back out there by hiring 2 rental vans because we didn't want to just sit still for 6 months and wait for that. But then it was kind of chasing our tails a little bit because we'd signed up to these podcasts and we had contractually obliged to produce those. So, we were kind of on a race then to hit all these spots. What would have been a leisurely circumnavigation around the whole continent turned out to be a quick kind of spider's web dash. But yeah, those first 4 months were incredible, but the 20-year-old van didn't do as well.
Honestly, I don't know what to say from that. That is horrific. I just thought that came into my head, probably not that interesting, but what would you have done differently in terms of the 20-year-old? Is it just the way, it's the way the cards fell, or, did you make a conscious decision to get it older?
Well, we made a few bad decisions, I suppose. I mean, our budget was not huge and motorhomes are expensive.
Yeah.
So, if you're looking at a new motorhome, they're like 90 grand plus. So there's absolutely no way of that happening. So one came up for 25 grand and it was this 20-year-old one. And we thought, right, well, we haven't seen any at that low price, quote marks. Maybe we should seriously look at this one. And we went out to it and, it seemed fine and blah, blah, blah. So this was 6 months before we went and we decided, right, well, let's get it now. And then, we've got the van ready to go. And it came with a 6-month warranty. And obviously that had run out just before we set off. So that was not smart move number 1. Yeah, not smart move number 2 was not being quite naive, I suppose, to mechanical issues. We have no idea about things like cam belts and probably should have looked into that. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it'll be an interesting part of the story when we get over the fact that it cost us an arm and a leg and made us cry quite a lot down the line. But right now it's still a thorn in our sides.
So one of the things we're always interested in as, well, I mean, I'm going to say newbie podcaster, Tom is much more established in this, is the impact that the stories have to people and listeners. And sometimes when we get an email from somebody saying, oh, I really enjoyed this episode, or this really made me think about this, or it connected in that way, it really gives you a kind of sense. Otherwise, it can sometimes feel like you're just sending conversations into the ether. So I'm kind of curious what feedback you've had from people and whether the podcast has had the impacts that you'd hoped when you set out on the journey.
Yeah, I mean, I was completely new to podcasting before I started this venture. As I say, I know about filmmaking and photography and telling stories, so this was a new way of doing that, but I had no idea how to do that, really. So yeah, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know how to really measure results. It's quite hard to try and sneakily look at other people's listening figures to see how you're comparing or what you should aim for. So I didn't really know. Of the small amount of info I could try and gather, I was quite pleasantly surprised with listener numbers to begin with on those first few episodes. It was more than I expected. It obviously helped partnering with an organisation like Rewilding Europe, who's got a big following as well in the kind of tens of thousands on their socials. And then also having conversations with lots of local initiatives on the ground, each with their own following as well. So that definitely helped with building an audience. It's interesting kind of stat-wise, all the way through the pattern seemed to be, I was getting about 2/3 of my listeners from the UK. So that kind of made sense because I'm from the UK and that's where my audience is. And we started the project as well with 2 from Scotland, so kind of built on that initial program. In the end, we've had, I think, over 130,000 downloads from 162 countries around the world. And yeah, it's been very nice to hear a lot of positive feedback from it, really. I think people have really enjoyed it. I mean, It's a bit of a niche interest group, really, that is people interested in rewilding and like to hear crap dad jokes, because that's kind of my raison d'etre, really. That's my motto for the podcast. So it's nice to see that there's so many people interested in that niche collaboration. The nicest feedback you always are going to get is when people hear about something and then want to get involved or do something themselves. And I had quite a few people saying that they were going to go and volunteer at different initiatives after listening to one of the podcasts. And yeah, if you just get one or two people like that, it makes it all worth it, because it's inspiring people to change their behaviors or act on the back of that kind of storytelling. I think that's what it comes down to. Storytelling is so important to motivate people. I think people always buy into people. So if you can get someone talking passionately, which is what all my contributors did, always in their second or third language as well, which I was always amazed at. Like, I struggled to string 2 sentences together in my own language, let alone someone else's. So they were absolutely brilliant. And I'm passionate about rewilding as well, of course. So I had the bigger overview of rewilding. I'm not really an expert in European rewilding. UK maybe, yes, but not European. So part of this was all about me finding out more. I was really interested in talking to these people and finding out about these initiatives and the species they were working with and how they all interact. So yeah, it was great to take people along for that ride, and they seemed to enjoy it, at least on the face of it.
Right. And I think it's that lovely thing about that, as you say, that joy becoming contagious, and then the ripple effects of that conversation having on someone else, and then they go and visit, and then they connect in, and it kind of platforming all of those kind of fantastic projects. You've completed your first podcast series, and that was a new medium for you. Where are you at in your relationship now to photography, documentaries, podcasting? Like, what are you thinking, right? Next steps or ideas?
Yeah, I've got a very niche set of skills, really, that only probably come together for a very select few people. I do photography and filmmaking. I do guiding as well for ecotourism stuff, photography and nature watching, sometimes also with a kind of rewilding specific focus, and now podcasting as well. So yeah, I guess that's why I would kind of describe myself quite pretentiously as more of a science communicator rather than just a photographer or filmmaker. I mean, that's partly because I'm a bit of a magpie and I like shiny things, and I always get distracted and think, oh, I'd like a go at that. Oh, I'd like to do this. Oh, what about that? And I do toy myself sometimes. Like, sometimes I feel like I want to get physically involved with the rewilding. I want to be the person planting that tree, or restoring that river, or up on the peatlands. So I do go back and forth with thinking, I want to do stuff like the people I'm chatting to do. But yeah, my skill is communication, and I think that we should all focus on something that we're good at to hopefully inspire change. I sat in an excavator in a Swedish river trying to move one of the boulders that they were restoring, and I moved one boulder in about 15 minutes. I was not good at river restoration. So yeah, I guess it makes sense to kind of focus on what you're doing. Going forwards, photography and film will probably creep back in as more of a communications tool. I'm focused a bit more on Scotland now. Moved back to the Cairngorms in March. I've been here for 6 months. I'm working with the charity that I used to work with on the sides again, Scotland Big Picture. So I do some work with them. So yeah, there's a kind of buffet of things that I try to do, and I like the variety of it. So yeah, I'm not very good at kind of sitting still or focusing on one aspect, which I probably should. I enjoy the lot of it.
I don't know. I think sometimes when you have these kind of systemic challenges like rewilding is, and you need everyone to come together with a systemic solution that involves all these different skills, and the fact that you've got interest in so many areas and skills in so many areas, I think is probably only a benefit, because it will bring great creativity to how you position yourself in relation to all these different stories that you're telling.
Absolutely. I mean, I think people think they can't get involved with rewilding because they're not an ecologist or they're not a conservationist. But these travels around Europe just absolutely opened my eyes to how wide a skill set we need. We need graphic designers, we need digger drivers, we need entrepreneurs, we need language experts, we need community experts. Like, there's so many different skill sets that can help make change in this world. And it really opened my eyes to that. And I think communications always used to be an afterthought for conservation projects. It always used to be, traditionally, conservation projects would do the good stuff on the ground, and then right at the end think, oh, we probably should tell someone about that. And then there's no budget left and no time, and it kind of goes into a newsletter and that's it, and they move on. And in some ways that's fine because the physical work gets done. But I think organizations nowadays are realizing that communications are key, and they can have a big multiplier effect on the work that they can do and the work they get done. And I think at Scotland Big Picture, the reason why that charity was quite successful is that we were a team of communicators that set up a rewilding charity. It was kind of the wrong way around almost. So we went in kind of all guns blazing with a really strong message and really great visuals and a really good conversation to be had. And that leaped the charity forwards in terms of ambition and scope as well. So it's really good to see communications kind of taking that step forward now and coming to the forefront of rewilding, conservation, nature restoration.
Absolutely. And if we want to move beyond the smaller scale, localized conservation projects and into larger scale rewilding, people are going to be at the heart of that. And when you want to engage people, you've got to communicate effectively with them. And yeah, I completely agree with that. So we're coming towards the end of the conversation today, and looking back on your 18-month adventure, it ended up being 18 months.
Yeah, definitely stretched out.
What are the things that you bring back now or you think about in relation to what you've taken from that experience?
Yeah, I think that one of the important things is to make sure that you're collaborating with a wide range of stakeholders. So I think for the best part in the world, in the UK, we're still a little bit too shouty. We still shout our viewpoints at other stakeholders and hope that they change their mind to align with ours. But what I would really like to see is that we try and find common ground in the middle somewhere and collaborate instead. Like one of the really fascinating initiatives I wanted to see was a lynx reintroduction project, because that's a big, obviously, topic of conversation, particularly in Scotland at the minute, about trying to get lynx back. So I really wanted to see how that worked in a European setting. So I met some of the team from the Life Lynx initiative. They're bringing lynx from the Carpathian Mountains in Romania to Slovenia and Croatia. And it was fascinating because it's not just conservationists doing that. It's conservationists and ecologists and foresters and local government and hunters. And quite surprisingly, it was the hunters that really wanted the lynx back in the first place. So in the 1970s, they actually started a lynx reintroduction project themselves, which was quite pioneering. They're really proud of their forests in Slovenia and the wildlife that inhabit there. And I guess lynx coming back would make them feel even more wild. So they led that program, which was interesting to me alone. And it worked really well up until a certain point, and then it got to a bit of a genetic bottleneck. And now what they're doing in the country, which is what the Life Lynx initiative is essentially a reinforcement project. But the hunters are still really involved there. So they know their ground so well because they're there all the time. And they're involved in monitoring and tracking, thinking of the best places where people have seen lynx so they could either trap them in Romania or where to release them in Slovenia. And it was integral to the success of that project. I'm not sure yet in the UK we'd have that conversation. I think things are getting better for sure. And I do see a lot of initiatives getting better at talking amongst different stakeholder groups. But we need to find that common ground if we're going to move things forwards. And it shouldn't just be a ticking box exercise. It shouldn't be, the application says we need to involve different stakeholder groups. So let's go and talk to some hunters and let's go and talk to some foresters. What it really should be about is, right, we've got all these different stakeholders involved. Let's not focus on our differences. Let's see where the different skill sets align and how we can utilize that to move things forwards. How we can maybe take some of the pressure off some of the negative issues that might come along. But let's focus on how we will make this journey a positive one. So that was really fascinating to me. And I think if we're going to move things forward in the UK, then we really need to get better at talking to each other and finding that common ground.
Sounds like this is a call to action to any communicators or people that are good at facilitating conversation or collaboration to come into rewilding, because we need your skills to support us on this journey. Thank you so much, James. I really enjoyed the conversation today. Some amazing anecdotes and what a fantastic story. We'll obviously have all the links in the show notes to your podcast and the fantastic treasure trove of episodes that there is there that people can dive into. But thank you again for your time today.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
That was great. And he just comes across as the kind of guy you want to go for a pint with down the pub. What I found particularly interesting, I think there are stories and things that have not been said there, like just the whole thing imploded and we had no idea how we're going to finish the contract, and we actually had no home, and the amount of stress that must have built up within the family unit. And again, it's one of those forging moments, I think, that what doesn't break you makes you stronger. So I'm sure in retrospect, they came out stronger because of the challenges.
I'm sure they were really well resourced from their 4 months of casually exploring wilder nature through France. So hopefully there were a lot of pennies in their piggy bank that could be spent in the time of disaster. Does that make sense?
I get what you're saying there, but you do know what life's like with 2 young kids in a confined space. I mean, when you say resourced and pennies in the bank, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that was necessarily the way that I would personally describe 4 months going through Europe. Maybe that says more about me than anything else.
But maybe this also speaks to the power of wilder nature, that there's a different experience parenting your children when they're allowed to roam free around nature reserves versus when you're trying to contain them through the trials of modern day life.
So this is what we've been doing wrong, is it? Just let them out, make them more feral.
Mud pies, streams.
I mean, we do that, but maybe we should just leave them out. Just shut the door, like with the dogs. Just shut the door and allow them to do their own thing.
Maybe a little rucksack of snacks and that'll be fun.
Anyway, we're digressing. Give me some reflections on the conversation.
I think my first is a related point, which is about the courage it takes to make a decision like James and his family did to actually, we're going to leave our jobs. We're going to step into somewhat unknown territory in terms of buying a camper van or motorhome, and heading out into the wild. And that entrepreneurial mindset that you mentioned, like all of those things, there's a lot of inner resource required for that. And I wonder whether it's something that we all need to draw. It feels like we're drawing on quite a bit of that at times with the project here. And I wonder where we help others to find that. Because I speak to a lot of people who are like, it's amazing what you're doing, or I'm feeling a bit frustrated with my career, but taking the step into doing something different, it feels really challenging.
That is true. But we are also seeing people who are starting to take those steps. And maybe if you're not so sure, if you're listening to this thinking, I'm not so sure I should do it, or it's a bit too risky for me, give us another couple of years. Let's see how the Grange project plays out. You can probably, if things go okay, then maybe you should have the confidence to do your own thing as well. I suppose one of my reflections is that it's a shame we kind of ran out of time to dig further into some of his rewilding projects, not his, but the ones that James went to as part of the podcast, because there's just so many, and I'm sure there's a million stories connected with each visit that he made.
And maybe there's a sneaky plug there to go back to the Rewild podcast, where you can listen to all 18 episodes in full and have that rich, immersive experience that we described of sometimes feeling like you're really in the place that he's talking about as far as you can with an audio medium in a visual arena.
Say that 3 times fast. It's definitely worth a shout out to Gemma, James's wife, for her amazing artwork. It might just be worth going to look at the podcast for the artwork there, because it is something special. I absolutely love the style, and it really makes the episodes pop. Any last thoughts, Chloe, before we close out?
I don't think we can finish without just briefly commenting on James's last point around the power of communication and storytelling. For me, this is just such a critical issue, because ultimately we have the solutions we need to get ourselves out of this systemic crisis. But it's about application of those solutions, and that's about human motivation, and that's about storytelling and meaning. We need to shift our society's relationship to nature so that they perceive the value to themselves and the value in nature in its own right. And that's not about doing anything complicated from a technical perspective or finding anything, doing a fancy new conservation method or assessing or monitoring nature in a different way. That's about helping people to shift their relationship, and that's about storytelling.
And it's a point we're constantly trying to get right, is this the marketing angle. You could actually have the world's best podcast that could solve all the world's problems in a 60-minute conversation. But if nobody knows it existed, you don't know how to get it out, and you haven't worked out the slightly more commercial, less palatable methods of making things go viral, then you may as well be wasting your time. So I think there's something there where you kind of swallow your, not pride is the wrong word, but you swallow your inhibitions when it comes to modern social media. You learn more about it and make sure you're not only applying time to generate quality conversations and content, but you get it out to the world as well.
And that communications happen in different spaces. Absolutely, they happen on social media, and that's where you're going to have the widest outreach. But they also happen on walks with people around our rewilding project, or when you're planting a tree together, or when we're sharing some food together. There are many opportunities to help influence this narrative.
Nice.
I can see the skepticism in your eyes.
No, I don't. I think it's really important to do that as well. But if you're trying to generate wider change, I think you've got to do both and, to coin a Chloe phrase. Right, shall we close out before I get into more trouble? Right, if you've got this far, thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you would like to support the podcast, the one thing that you can do that makes a big difference is spending 5 minutes rating, reviewing the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts on. It allows us to raise the awareness of what we're doing and get more listeners who can benefit from our amazing guests. Until next episode, Chloe, anything left to say? Inspirational?
Well, I'm running a little short of inspiration, but just wanting to offer a lot of gratitude to you as the listeners, and hope you've enjoyed the episode.
Perfect.